Science is supposed to have rules. A line nobody crosses, no matter how badly they want the answer. For most of the 20th century, that line did not exist. Governments, universities, and hospitals ran experiments on people who never agreed to be experimented on: soldiers, prisoners, orphans, the poor, the disabled, the dying. They called it research. They called it national security. They called it progress. What follows are 27 of those experiments. Every one of them happened. Every one of them was real. 1. In 1932, the United States Public Health Service began tracking syphilis in roughly 400 black sharecroppers in Alabama, promising free health care in return. The men were never told they had syphilis. They were told they had bad blood. For 40 years, doctors withheld treatment just to watch the disease run its course, and kept withholding it even after penicillin became the standard cure in the 1940s. Men went blind. Men went insane. Men died slowly while their doctors took notes. The study only ended in 1972, after a whistleblower leaked it to the press. Tuskegee did not end because the ethics changed. It ended because someone finally talked. 2. Tuskegee was not unique. It was a rehearsal. In 1946, the same doctor who would later help run it, John Cutler, was given a country with no journalists watching: Guatemala. Over 2 years, researchers deliberately infected approximately 1,300 soldiers, prisoners, sex workers, and orphans with syphilis, gonorrhea, and chancroid. Some were exposed through paid sex workers. Others had bacteria smeared directly into open wounds. Children as young as the orphanage allowed were tested too. The experiment stayed buried for over 60 years until a historian found the records by accident. The United States apologized in 2010. The men who lived through it were already old or already dead. 3. Across the Pacific, Japan's Unit 731 ran its own version with no pretense of medicine at all. Throughout the 1930s and into World War II, Japanese military doctors used Chinese, Korean, and Soviet prisoners for vivisection, cutting into living, unanesthetized bodies to study organ function. They tested frostbite by freezing limbs solid. They tested biological weapons by deliberately spreading plague and cholera through villages. When the war ended, the United States quietly granted the scientists immunity in exchange for their data. The world prosecuted Nazi doctors at Nuremberg. The architects of Unit 731 went home. 4. In the camps at Auschwitz, Joseph Mengele ran his own studies on twins, believing their identical biology made them the perfect control group. He injected dye into children's eyes to try to turn brown eyes blue. He infected one twin with disease and left the other healthy, then compared the results. When one twin died, he would sometimes kill the other immediately, just to study both bodies side by side while the data was still fresh. After the war, Mengele escaped to South America and was never caught. The children who survived him grew old carrying scars nobody could explain to people who hadn't been there. 5. Back in the United States, the state of Illinois found a quieter way to get its volunteers: parole. From 1944 onward, inmates at Stateville Penitentiary were deliberately infected with malaria so researchers could test new anti-malarial drugs on a captive, controllable population. Prisoners were offered shortened sentences and small cash payments to take part. Some drugs caused dangerous, even fatal reactions. The study's own report, written by a doctor named Andrew Ivy, was later used as evidence at the Nuremberg doctors' trial, cited as proof that prison populations couldn't truly give free consent. The men who built that defense never thought their own prisoners would become Exhibit A. 6. In Sweden, the target wasn't disease. It was teeth. From 1945 to 1955, patients at Vipholm Hospital, a facility for the intellectually disabled, were fed enormous quantities of sugar, including a specially manufactured, extra sticky toffee designed to cling to enamel longer than anything sold commercially. Researchers wanted hard data linking sugar to cavities, and a captive population that couldn't refuse the candy was the easiest way to get it. By the time the study ended, 50 patients had teeth so decayed they were ruined for life. The findings became the foundation of modern dental health guidance. The patients who paid for it were never asked. 7. In post-war Massachusetts, scientists found their test subjects in a science club. Boys at the Fernald State School, an institution for children labeled feeble-minded, were recruited with promises of baseball games and Mickey Mouse watches. What they actually received was oatmeal and milk laced with radioactive iron and calcium, funded in part by Quaker Oats, who wanted nutritional bragging rights over a rival cereal. Some boys were directly injected with radioactive calcium. None of their parents were told radiation was involved. The boys didn't learn the truth until television news broke the story, almost 50 years later. 8. The radiation experiments didn't stop at children. Between 1945 and 1947, Manhattan Project doctors secretly injected 18 hospital patients with plutonium, simply to study how the human body absorbed and excreted it. None of the 18 were told what was in the syringe. One subject, a construction worker named Eb Cade, had been admitted for injuries from a car crash. Not cancer, not a terminal illness, nothing that would have made him an acceptable subject by the program's own stated rules. He survived for years afterward, never knowing. Across the same Cold War program, pregnant women at a Nashville hospital were given radioactive cocktails disguised as prenatal vitamins, and prisoners in Oregon and Washington had their testicles irradiated with neutrons. 9. In Cincinnati, the target shifted from curiosity to warfare. From 1960 to 1971, at least 90 cancer patients at Cincinnati General Hospital were exposed to total or partial body irradiation, funded in part by the Department of Defense, which wanted to understand how American soldiers would fare after a nuclear war. Patients weren't told the Pentagon was paying for their treatment. For the first 5 years, they weren't given consent forms at all. When forms finally appeared, none of them mentioned that the radiation could kill. Many patients died within months of exposure. Decades later, families suing in court alleged something even darker: that researchers had forged some of the signatures on those forms. 10. The U.S. government didn't need a hospital to find radiation test subjects. It had an ocean. After the 1954 Castle Bravo hydrogen bomb test went badly wrong, far more powerful than predicted, with fallout drifting over inhabited islands, the residents of Rongelap Atoll in the Marshall Islands were evacuated late, then deliberately studied instead of simply treated. The program was called Project 4.1. Officials internally compared the islanders to laboratory mice. No one asked the Marshallese for consent. Decades of cancer and birth defects followed. Some of those islands are still uninhabitable. 11. San Francisco didn't need a bomb. It got bacteria instead. In 1950, a Navy ship spent a week spraying bacteria off the California coast to test how vulnerable a major city would be to a biological attack. Residents breathed it in by the millions without ever knowing the air had changed. Within weeks, 11 people checked into Stanford Hospital with rare, severe infections. One man, recovering from routine surgery, was dead within 3 weeks. The Navy called the bacteria harmless. Stanford's own doctors had never seen an outbreak like it before, and never saw one again. 12. Inside Philadelphia's Holmesburg prison, the experiments needed no bombs or bacteria at all. Just skin. From 1951 to 1974, dermatologist Albert Kligman tested over 250 different chemical compounds on the prison's mostly black inmate population. Corrosive creams, viruses, fungal infections, and dioxin, the toxic component later linked to Agent Orange, funded in part by Dow Chemical. Kligman described his first impression of the prison in one chilling sentence: rows of inmates looked to him like a farmer's field, ready for harvest. He went on to invent Retin A and become one of dermatology's most celebrated names. The university that employed him didn't formally apologize until August 2021, that the city of Philadelphia apologized in October 2022. 13. Across the city's psychiatric hospitals, a different population was being mined for science: developmentally disabled children. At Willowbrook State School, doctors deliberately infected residents with hepatitis to study how the disease spread and to develop a vaccine. The institution itself was already overcrowded and abusive, and researchers used that existing chaos as justification, arguing the children were going to catch hepatitis anyway. Parents who refused to sign consent forms sometimes found there was simply no other space available for their child. The vaccine research succeeded. The ethics committee that eventually reviewed the study did not. 14. Not every experiment needed a needle. In 1939, a graduate student named Mary Tudor, working under psychologist Wendell Johnson, set out to test whether stuttering could be deliberately created. 22 orphan children in Davenport, Iowa were split into 2 groups. One group, who spoke completely normally, was repeatedly told their speech was flawed and getting worse. The children believed it. Some developed real speech anxiety. Some refused to speak at all. Decades later, one of the orphans, by then an elderly woman, said the experience had quietly ruined parts of her entire life. The University of Iowa apologized in 2001, 36 years after Johnson's death. 15. Psychologist Harry Harlow didn't need orphans. He used infant monkeys. Starting in the 1950s, Harlow separated newborn rhesus monkeys from their mothers to study attachment, then escalated into something darker. A steel chamber he called, without irony, the pit of despair. Baby monkeys were sealed inside, alone in total darkness, for up to a year. When released, they were psychologically destroyed, incapable of normal social behavior for the rest of their lives. Harlow defended the work as essential to understanding human depression. His own colleagues called it a violation of basic decency, and the public backlash helped push American science toward its first real animal ethics committees. 16. In New Zealand, doctors didn't need to create harm from scratch. They simply chose not to stop it. At Auckland's National Women's Hospital, gynecologist Herbert Green ran a decades-long study on cervical precancer, deliberately leaving women's abnormal cells untreated to observe how the condition progressed naturally, rather than removing it, the way standard medical practice already recommended. Some of the women involved had actual early-stage cancer, not just precancerous cells. Many were never told they were part of a study at all. By the time a journalist exposed it in 1987, the country called it New Zealand's Tuskegee, and meant it. 17. South Africa's military found a different group to study, its own gay soldiers. From 1969 to 1987, the Aversion Project subjected conscripts identified as homosexual to electric shock therapy, chemical castration, and, when those methods failed, forced gender reassignment surgery. Subjects were strapped into chairs and shocked while viewing images meant to correct their attraction. The program operated under apartheid's military medical system for nearly 2 decades before it was shut down. South Africa's Medical Association didn't formally apologize until 1995. 18. American science didn't need a war or a regime to justify cruelty. Sometimes a university lecture hall was enough. In 1961, psychologist Stanley Milgram told ordinary volunteers at Yale they were helping test memory and punishment. In reality, he was testing obedience. An actor, hidden in another room, pretended to receive increasingly painful electric shocks every time the volunteer got an answer wrong. Most subjects kept going, past screaming, past pleading, past silence, simply because a man in a lab coat told them to continue. Milgram had set out to explain how ordinary Germans participated in the Holocaust. What he proved instead was that almost anyone, anywhere, could be talked into doing the same thing. 19. A decade later, Stanford psychologist Philip Zimbardo wanted to see what a prison did to ordinary people. So he built one in a basement. College students were randomly assigned to be guards or prisoners for a planned 2-week study. The guards escalated almost immediately. Strip searches, sleep deprivation, solitary confinement, made-up punishments designed purely to humiliate. Several prisoners suffered breakdowns. Zimbardo himself, acting as prison superintendent, didn't intervene until an outside observer finally confronted him. The experiment was shut down after 6 days, and for decades it was taught as proof that ordinary people will turn cruel the moment a role allows it. Then the tape surfaced. Recordings show Zimbardo's own research team coaching the guards beforehand, explicitly telling them to act tough. The cruelty wasn't spontaneous. It was directed. Psychology's most famous prison wasn't a window into human nature. It was a performance nobody knew they were watching. 20. Long before Milgram or Zimbardo, in 1920, psychologist John B. Watson wanted to prove that fear could be manufactured rather than born. His subject was an infant he called Little Albert. Watson repeatedly paired a gentle white rat with a sudden, loud, frightening noise, until the baby began crying at the sight of the rat alone. Then at rabbits, then at a Santa Claus mask, then at anything resembling fur. Watson never reversed the conditioning. He never followed up to see what happened to the child afterward. The baby who became one of psychology's most famous case studies simply vanished from the record once the data had been collected. 21. Harvard didn't need an infant. It used its own honor students. From 1959 to 1962, psychologist Henry Murray subjected 22 undergraduates to what he privately described as vehement, sweeping, and personally abusive verbal attacks. Assaults specifically tailored to demolish each student's most personal beliefs, filmed and replayed back to them afterward. One of those 22 students went by the code name Lawful. His real name was Theodore Kaczynski. He would later describe the experience as the worst of his life. Years before he became the Unabomber, mailing bombs to professors and executives for nearly 2 decades. 22. While Harvard tested minds, the CIA wanted to control them. In 1953, biological warfare scientist Frank Olson attended a retreat with colleagues from a covert program called MKUltra. Unknown to him, his drink had been spiked with LSD. 9 days later, deeply disturbed and begging to quit the program, Olson fell to his death from a 13th-floor hotel window in New York. For over 20 years, the government called it a suicide brought on by a bad trip. In 1994, his family had his body exhumed. The new autopsy found cranial injuries inconsistent with simply falling, and the medical examiner changed the cause of death to homicide. 23. Olson's death was only one thread of MKUltra. In safe houses across San Francisco and New York, CIA operatives ran something called Operation Midnight Climax, paying sex workers to lure men back to government-rented apartments, secretly dose their drinks with LSD, and observe the results through two-way mirrors. The men never knew they'd been drugged. They never knew they were being filmed. The operation ran for roughly a decade before internal CIA review finally shut it down, calling its own program abhorrent. 24. Outside the brothels, the Army wanted soldiers, not strangers. Between 1948 and 1975, nearly 7,000 American servicemen at Edgewood Arsenal in Maryland were exposed to more than 250 chemicals: nerve agents, tear gas, LSD, and an incapacitating compound called BZ that could trigger days of delirium. Some volunteers were misled about what they were actually signing up for. Others were simply never told. The program ran for almost 3 decades before a congressional investigation finally exposed its coercive recruiting and shut it down in 1975. 25. Not every experiment needed a drug at all. In the late 1960s, sociologist Laud Humphreys wanted to understand the secret lives of men who had anonymous sex with other men in public restrooms, a behavior criminalized across the country at the time. Posing as a lookout, he embedded himself in the encounters to observe them directly. Then he secretly recorded the license plates of the men involved, traced their names and addresses through police contacts, and tracked dozens of them down for interviews at their own homes, without ever revealing how he'd found them. Most of the men, Humphreys discovered, weren't gay at all. They were married, religious, conservative. Men whose entire double lives Humphreys had quietly unlocked, and they never knew it. 26. Sometimes the deception cut the other way, used not on strangers but on a child's own identity. In 1965, after a botched circumcision left an infant named David Reimer with irreparable damage, psychologist John Money convinced the boy's parents to raise him as a girl instead, hailing the case as proof that gender was purely learned, not innate. For years, Money published the case as a triumph, without disclosing how deeply unhappy the child actually was. David never identified as the gender he'd been assigned, eventually transitioned back as an adult, and spent the rest of his life undoing what one psychologist's theory had done to him before he was old enough to speak. 27. By the time most of these experiments finally surfaced, the men and women behind them were already retired, decorated, or dead. Apologies came decades late, if they came at all, quiet statements buried beneath the more comfortable parts of these scientists' legacies. The Nuremberg Code was written specifically to prevent this. It did not stop it. It simply taught the people doing it to write better paperwork. The line between research and atrocity was never really about chemistry, or radiation, or psychology. It was about whether anyone in the room was willing to say no. And for most of the 20th century, almost no one was. Which one of these unsettled you the most? Tell us below. If this changed how you look at the word volunteer, hit like. Subscribe. We're not done uncovering what science was willing to call progress.